Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Laura Sicola with Vocal Impact Productions, and most recently, I started a video series analyzing the candidates' performance from the Democratic primary debates for the upcoming 2020 presidential election. Today, as opposed to doing a very broad overview of some of the primary trends, what I wanted to do is do a deep dive into the performance of the women. There's 6 women, about 30% of the candidates who participated in the initial debate round. And I wanted to look at what makes them particularly effective or ineffective in the way that they message their ideas, the way that they explain, express, and otherwise deliver their campaign promises, and from there, project a little bit about how I think that's going to influence their ultimate results and how much progress they make towards the election, toward the nomination, and ultimately towards the presidency. Remember, of course, that my work is strictly looking at leadership communication and influence. I am not political. I am not taking sides. I am not in any way, shape, or form indicating whether I praise a candidate's performance or criticize it, indicating my preferences as to who I would or would not vote for one way or another. Okay, so as a quick background and reminder, there were a couple of key criteria for effective messaging that we established in the first video. The one is the importance of soundbite messaging. To the extent possible, to take your primary campaign promises and distill them down into 2 to 5 word sound bites that you could repeat over and over again to reinforce whenever necessary so that you become memorable and people can easily say, this person stands for X, for Y, and for Z. Because if people can't understand it and remember it, they can't recite it, they can't talk about it with their friends in debates later on, and it just makes your promises and you unmemorable, easily forgettable. Not helpful. And what's important, of course, with that is that you start it with an action verb and that it presents a key deliverable, an end result that is clear, concrete, inspiring, and worth voting for. The second criterion for effective messaging is the ability to project credibility consistently in your messaging. And what I mean by projecting credibility is the ability to balance your 3 different messaging channels, your speech channels, all at the same time. And that's the verbal, the vocal, and the visual channels. The verbal is your content, what you say, the data that you include, the examples, the stories you tell, the word choice you use, whether or not you have a lot of fillers. It's all of the what. If you saw a transcript, what would it look like? What would it include? What would it miss? The second is the vocal delivery. And this is going not just from what you say, but how you say it. What do those messages sound like? This includes your speed, your volume, your intonation, the highs and the lows, and your tonality. If you pause, or if you don't. And then, of course, the third channel is your visual channel. And this is the physical communication, your facial expressions, your body language, how you look overall, and how that reinforces or undermines what else you're trying to convey to the audience. And ultimately, those 3 things need to match for you to be credible. When there's mixed signals or something inconsistent, it inspires doubt and you lose your credibility. So with that, I'm going to take some time and go through each of the 6 candidates, look at their strengths and their weaknesses in each of those areas. From that first round of debates. And there's a lot of text that I'm going to want to be citing, so I'll be reading some of the script directly from what they said. So first, Elizabeth Warren. Now, she verbally was clearly very knowledgeable. She had lots of experience, lots of examples that she was able to cite from her own work. She gave statistics, detailed examples, and explanations of her understanding of issues like the environment, the economy, healthcare, etc. So she did come across as smart. Similarly, vocally, she was strong, she was authoritative, she was passionate, she was convicted, but she did speak a little on the fast side more often than not. Granted, they are under great time pressure to get everything in 30 to 45 seconds, which of course is a challenge. We just have to make sure that speed doesn't undermine the listener's ability to actually catch what you said. It doesn't matter if you finish saying everything you want to say if it's too fast for anybody to understand or remember. Rule number 1. And as far as her visual is concerned, she did smile at first, but that was about it. And the rest was pretty consistently unhappy in her projection. Weaknesses, again, she was smart, but her specifics were hard to remember because, number one, from a verbal perspective, she had virtually no sound bites. She gave some specific promises that she stands for, or she gave some general promises that she stands for and lots of long explanations. But if I asked you to give me 3 examples of what her promises are, I don't know if you'd be able to. I personally would really have to think about how to explain it, and it would be kind of convoluted at best. She also didn't really give any stories. Stories bring data to life, and personal stories humanize the candidate. She did mention that, as a young woman, she almost wasn't able to afford applying to, much less attending college, and she, at the last minute, got the chance through a local commuter school, but it wasn't really a story. It was just a passing reference. So it was a little bit harder to relate to, and she didn't directly connect it to what she was talking about in that moment and to the point that she made next. Vocally, she was passionate, but it bordered pretty consistently on angry. Now, part of the problem there also is that her voice, naturally, is a little on the thin side. It's a little bit scratchy, just slightly. But when she gets worked up, the thinness becomes a lot more evident, as opposed to, for example, Kamala Harris's voice, which is very rich, very resonant, no matter what she's talking about or how she feels about it. So when Elizabeth Warren got worked up about something, her voice, the thinness became more obvious, and her voice cracked a couple of times here and there. And that combination, unfortunately, projects the image of being old. And no matter how smart she is, nobody wants to feel like they're sending, quote unquote, a granny to the office, an old lady. That's the one thing where she might be sending off the wrong vibe, as opposed to being experienced, strong, authoritative, knowledgeable. A physical weakness indicator is something that can undermine your overall image and credibility, as opposed to Bill Clinton's, for example, regular voice, which was pretty raspy from start to finish and still is. That's mostly from overuse. It's not reflective of age in the same way that hers could be taken. Visually, she had 2 challenges. One was that her head, again, because she was so intense about the whole thing, her head perpetually did this. And that no motion was very consistent, very intense. And you don't want people, even to the extent that you're complaining about something, you don't want people to be associating you with the word no. It's just bad when you go to the voting booth. Similarly, her hand gestures, at some point she was finger pointing palm down. So the pointing was coming at the people, was coming at the camera, was coming at the audience. Nobody wants anybody to point a finger at them. Even if she was talking to the Republicans, to President Trump, to whoever else it was, the fact is it was aiming at the audience in a very accusatory manner. And that makes people feel on the defensive. It can be off-putting. So I would recommend that she tone that piece down. Okay, moving on. Candidate number 2, Amy Klobuchar. Strengths. Let's see. She did give a few statistics here and there about how African-American women are paid 61 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a white man makes. And she did start a few stories. She started them, but she didn't finish them. With regard to gun control, she said that any issue that comes up, she asks herself as kind of a litmus or a sort of a gauge, would this hurt my Uncle Dick's gear stand? And that's a personal connection to the industry, and I think that's important, but she just asked that one question. I think she needed to talk us through the thought process and how that would influence her decisions and how it would help her to connect to other people like that. You have to make those extrapolations a bit more explicit because people won't otherwise. I do, however, give her credit for tactfully taking back the floor on something, and this is an issue that is often expressed by my female clients in corporate America, where they'll be talking about something and a man will say something very similar later on and seem to be getting the credit for it. And often then the woman will just sort of be frustrated that he sort of stole our thunder. And she didn't let that happen. where Jay Inslee had referenced being the only person on the panel there to pass a law requiring insurance to cover abortion procedures in what's known as the public option. She jumped right in and said, the idea that I put out there, the public option, which the governor was talking about, so she's basically saying, look, he's talking about that, but that was mine. That's something that I've been working on. That's something, so she didn't, even though he didn't take it from her in the moment, she made sure that it was clear that that was an issue that she felt belonged to her and her record. So I give her credit for gracefully taking that back. I also give her partial credit for once again starting a great message, but dropping the ball. She said that one thing to know about her, in her closing statements, she said, I can win and beat Donald Trump. I've won every place, every race, every time. I've won in the reddest of districts, ones in which Donald Trump won by 20 points. Now, that's great stuff, but she should have stuck with that at the beginning, the middle, and the end, framing herself as a winner. This is something that Donald Trump did in 2016, and I guarantee he will do it again, framing himself as a winner and everybody else as losers. So she needs to begin and run with that narrative now. What battles has she won? If she can establish herself as a winner, she will have a lot more to go on, a lot more momentum in this race. And the more she says it, the more others will internalize it just because it'll stick in their minds. Now, vocally and visually, on the whole, she's generally likable. She's nice. She smiled at appropriate times. She's not threatening. She's not annoying. She didn't rub me the wrong way at any point or time. Frankly, it's also her weakness because it comes across as, well, it's not a problem. It's also very average, kind of vanilla. And that'll keep you in the middle of the pack until it puts you at the bottom of the pack. Nice alone or nice as a primary descriptor is not going to get the results that you want. Along those lines, some other weaknesses of hers, she had no sound bites. She had no fully delivered stories, as I mentioned before. She also deliberately avoided a couple of questions, like with regard to illegal border crossing and if it should be criminal or just a civil offense. And she just sort of pivoted and talked about generic pro-immigrant philosophies and stances. And personally, as a voter, that's one thing that I can't stand when candidates do. I can't stand when they do it, no matter what side they're on, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise. Have the integrity to answer the question. If it's clear that you're trying to skirt around an issue, then it means that either you don't have, to me, what it says is that either you don't have an answer, you haven't figured out where you stand yet, and you're avoiding, or you do have something that you believe that you want to happen, or you're afraid I won't, but you're afraid I won't like it, and that it'll hurt you in the polls. And either way, that's telling me that you're not going to let me know what I would be voting for if I vote for you. It's just a matter of integrity to me. All candidates should answer a question. Qualify it if you need, but don't dance around it. No tap dancing should be the rule. So enough on that point. And then with regard to her organization on a couple of answers, I think that also hurt her. So for example, with regard to the question of does she believe in free college, she did eventually get around to saying that she supports free community college, but she lost me first because she didn't get right to that response. She started out by prefacing some generic references to Trump and the economy and this and that, and I thought, she's avoiding the answer again. Now, fortunately, I stayed listening, and I did realize where she was going, but she almost lost me because it took her too long to get there. And I think most voters will have tuned out and just gone, she did it again. She's running away from the answer. You have to start with a soundbite. Where do you stand? Give me the soundbite, and then qualify with any other way you want. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with her the way what she said or how she said it, but there was really nothing memorable either. So inherently average means inherently forgettable. All right, moving on from there. Candidate number 3, Tulsi Gabbard. Gabbard's strengths and her weaknesses were actually sort of two sides of the same coin because she had some really good moments and some really good opportunities there, but she never milked them for their full value. She didn't really respect the weight and the value of what she had. It was like she was serving you filet mignon, but with a side of ketchup. So most importantly, her strength is that she's a veteran. She was in active duty in Iraq. So her examples on those issues were knowledge-based. They were incredibly respect-worthy and respectable, but they were kind of hard to connect with because of how she delivered them. And she really needed to be able to tell those examples as stories. And she just didn't milk that. She completely avoided the question about equal pay. Again, don't avoid a question. Instead, she just talked about her military history, deployment in Iraq, and keeping America safe. Good messages, not relevant to the question. Drives me nuts. Her verbal breakout moment, and she had a couple of them, the primary one was where she cleanly shot down Tim Ryan twice. First, with regard to his comment about American engagement in foreign wars and how we would respond to veterans, saying that to her, as a soldier having served in active duty in the Middle East, that his answer was absolutely unacceptable. She just laid him out right then and there, and his reaction was clearly uncomfortable and looked away and whatever else, which showed he knew she won. But then he tried to defend himself and made it worse, because he then referenced the Taliban and 9/11, and she jumped right back in and said it wasn't the Taliban who flew planes into our buildings on 9/11, that was Al-Qaeda. And she just, once again, very matter-of-factly stated it and kind of popped his balloon right then and there. But I think she could have really milked that a little bit more in a graceful way, but otherwise putting a nail in his coffin if she had said something like, Congressman, respectfully, if you don't know the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, you're clearly not ready to lead our troops or our country as commander-in-chief. I mean, to me, that would have been like, okay, he's done, move along, next. The challenge, of course, is that she's got these great pieces, but her delivery is flat. She needs some of Warren's fire. She's just too blasé in all of her delivery. She has no expressions on her face. Her voice barely modulates. It's like listening to a mannequin with a soundtrack. And that just loses all the color, all the fire. You know, if you're not fired up about your own experiences, how are you going to be fired up about defending me, my rights, and giving me as a citizen all the opportunities that you claim that I deserve? I think she also missed the opportunity to milk the question about changing her vote with regard to gay marriage. And, you know, she originally was more conservative and had voted against it. And in the last 6 years, she did clarify that she, since then, has been pro-gay rights. You know, she explained reasonably, I thought, that she'd had a socially conservative upbringing, and through experience and getting to know more people, especially through serving with LGBTQ service members in the military, and how they give their lives for each other, meaning those service members and her mutually, it was, again, just sort of stated. And it lost the chance to really use this as a role model moment where she could say, something to emphasize her own personal growth and how this is something that we all should be striving to. Does anybody really still have all the same views that they had when they were 10 or 20? If you haven't grown at all since then, that's a problem. So she should highlight this as a positive. And even if she were to say something like, you can't always walk a mile in someone's shoes, but you can walk a mile with them side by side. And we, meaning her and her service members, her colleagues, we walked miles together in combat boots in the desert. They'd give their life for me, and I'd give my life for them. I mean, that's just so much more powerful to show her new sense of unity and collaboration through personal experience and personal growth. I just think she could have done a whole lot more with that. And then in her closing, once again, she just kind of went generic. She mentioned that the government was created of the people, for the people, but not if it's of or for the rich and powerful. Referenced healthcare, clean water, good jobs. Frankly, everything that she said was exactly the same as what everybody else stands for up there. There was nothing unique, nothing memorable, nothing interesting. And once again, overall, her delivery from start to finish was just sort of one note. And I guarantee that Trump is going to latch onto that if he has the opportunity and use that to come up with whatever her nickname is that he's going to use to dismiss her as not a viable candidate and not even a competitor for that matter, someone who doesn't have what it takes. Okay, number 4, Kirsten Gillibrand. Now, I want to preface by saying there's an inherent difference between commanding respect and demanding respect. If you command respect inherently, you never have to explicitly demand that someone give it to you. And that's really critical because Gillibrand was particularly inconsistent in the way that she delivered different messages throughout her time on the stage. And there were times when she did really effectively command respect, and there were other times when she didn't and or had to actually demand it, and when she demanded it, frankly, she lost it. So here's a couple of big swings for her. Her big highlight moment, her big strength, was when she was discussing reproductive rights. She was the most consistently authoritative, well-developed in her discussion points about compromises made behind closed doors and how legislation gets done, who she's had to fight to protect women's reproductive rights, and then she brought it home with this great imagine statement. And any marketer will tell you the word imagine is a great way to get people to see themselves in your shoes and to connect with them. And she did that, saying that to imagine, and she's saying this, she looked straight in the camera and said, to all the women and the men who love them, imagine that when we beat President Trump, when Mitch McConnell walks into the Oval Office to negotiate, I believe she actually said, God forbid, and the door closes, who do you want sitting behind that desk to fight for women's rights? And then she reiterated her track record of advocacy. Like, that was a real powerhouse moment where she just owned it. And the content was great. The delivery was great. She was completely in alignment, verbally, vocally, and visually. The second time was with regard to immigration. And she said, and I'll quote, she was great about really driving home the point and drawing the listener's attention to what was most important. She said that the fact that 7 children have died in his custody, the fact that dozens of children have been separated from their parents, and they have no plan to reunite them. This is really very passionate and very specific and very directed, very focused, very authoritative. That was a great beginning to the point. But then she went into her plan and the steps that she wanted to take, and she suddenly went into what I call mental list mode and using what's known as upspeak. And upspeak is that pattern where it sounds like you're asking lots of questions with your voice, even when you're not. As soon as she started to list out her plan for how to change these problems in the way we're handling immigration, she shifted right into upspeak. It was like she was asking a litany of questions instead of emphasizing what she truly believed needed to happen. So, and again, I'm going to read this and I'm going to use my finger to go with my voice to show where she rose. So she said, first, I would fight for comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship. Second, I would reform how we treat asylum seekers at the border. I would have a community-based treatment center where you're doing it within the communities, where asylum seekers are given lawyers, where there's real immigration judges, not employees of the Attorney General, but appointed for life, and to have a community-based system. I would fund border security. You see where I'm going with this? Now, this is problematic on a couple of levels. First, on a completely subjective, subconscious level, it's annoying after a while, and whereas there are some people who won't mind it, others, frankly, will, and they'll tune her out and turn her off. But it also sounds, more importantly, it sounds insecure. It's like she's suddenly begging for validation, like she's not quite as confident. She's confident in what she stated in her analysis of what has happened, but she's not confident in her projection of what she will do, or if she's certain whether or not you'll like it. It's because when you ask all those question tones in your statements, it's like you're saying, okay, right, at which point you're implicitly begging for validation over and over again. She just undermined all her own authority because it doesn't sound like she's even really convinced in what she's saying. And if she is not convinced, why would we be? So then the irony is that as soon as she finished that list, she shifted right back into that authoritative, aligned mode again, because she said, but the worst thing President Trump has done is he has diverted the funds away from cross-border terrorism, cross-border security, and he's given that money to the for-profit prisons. I would not be spending money in for-profit prisons to lock up children and asylum seekers. Now, can you hear the difference in how she intoned and inflected and emphasized one chunk of speech from the other? The beginning and the end chunks were great. The middle just lost all credibility, all authority in the middle of it. So as far as any other weaknesses were concerned, again, she had no real sound bites. I mean, I just quoted a ton of what she just said. I still couldn't summarize it. I need those takeaway points. Again, in previous examples, some places she really commanded respect, but where she demanded it and it just was really weak. At one point, Bennett tried to interrupt her in a question that was posed to her, and she turned right around to him and snapped, "It's my turn." And the irony is, to me, that's what I heard in my head was my 3-year-old, who now is in exactly that mode. It's my turn, it's my turn, it's my turn. And I thought, oh, you cannot sound like my 3-year-old and run for president. That's not a good thing. So by her initial need to demand respect, she instantly lost mine for that moment. Also vocally, when she goes into upspeak, she can start to sound shrill, especially with the energy behind it. It kind of forces the voice to sound more like this. And men in particular are going to latch onto that as reasons not to like her. So she's going to want to be careful not to let that control her. Otherwise, it can be one of those borderline deciding factors that make people say, well, I don't want to listen to that for 4 years, which is also one of the challenges that Hillary had. Visually, she's attractive, which helps. But in some ways, she kind of looks a little bit like Hillary. So if she starts to sound like Hillary in some of the not great ways, and she looks a little bit like Hillary, people are going to leap to the opportunity. Opponents are going to leap to the opportunity to use that against her. Not necessarily opponents who are on the stage, but just people who don't like her. She also oddly blinks a lot as she's talking. So it's one of those things where you don't notice it until you notice it, and then you can't not notice it. So she may want to get that under control. Okay, next, let's talk about Kamala Harris. Strengths. I love that she never had to demand respect, but her manner of speaking always naturally commanded it. She was far and away the best performer in this particular aspect of round one. Her first breakout moment of the night was when the candidates in the very beginning all started scrambling to get attention and to jump in, and she just set the record straight right off the bat and said, look, America doesn't want to witness a food fight. They want to know how we're going to put food on the table. And even Biden clapped for her after stating that. So people behaved a little bit better afterwards. So she definitely stepped up right from the beginning as a leader who people respected and were willing to follow. She was also the only candidate that night to tell real stories. Personal stories, like stories of neighborhood children when she was young who weren't allowed to play with her because she was Black, as well as some archetypal stories of Latin American mothers who have to make the heart-wrenching decision to send their children with a coyote to smuggle them across the border illegally. And either way, these are real stories, they're personal, they illustrate and humanize issues at hand. And she delivered them perfectly. They were passionate and compassionate without being overly emotional or overly angry or overly anything in a way that would eventually come back to haunt her. They were perfectly measured in their delivery to suit the image that she was looking to project and the tone that she wanted to set. Now, as far as soundbite messaging is concerned, she had some efforts, but it was inconsistent and really could have been and needed to be tighter. So with regard to the immigration crisis, for example, she had a good list of changes like reinstating DACA, extending deferral of deportation for their parents and veterans who fought for the country, enacting a plan to process asylum cases and releasing children from cages, getting rid of private detention centers. In there were some sound bites. Reinstate DACA. Great soundbite. But extending deferral of deportation for their parents and veterans who have fought, there's got to be a way to tighten that up or separate them, or just pick one and have it be what you stand for. It can't be the full laundry list. Pick a couple that are going to be your top most important. She also had a very clear message with regard to the economy and specifically jobs. She said, no American should have to work more than one job to put a roof over their head and food on their table. Now, that's great. That was really clear, reasonably concise. If there's a way to get that down to something a little bit tighter that people can recite more easily, that would be great. I mean, a car in every driveway and a chicken in every pot. Those are a little bit more soundbitey, going back to much earlier candidates and elections. But nevertheless, it's sort of reminiscent of the same themes. Even if she'd been able to say something along the lines of, one job that provides for a full living and a full life, whatever it takes, get it down so it's tighter and more repeatable for other people. She also had a really great but subtle gender reference. At one point she said, I want to ensure that this microphone that the President of the U.S. holds in her hand is used in a way that reflects the values of this country. And I thought that was very subtle, very clever as a way to reference, yes, we want to get a woman in the White House, but she didn't have to keep repeating the woman refrain. I think Hillary relied on that a little bit too much. We need a woman in the White House. We need a woman in the White House. We need a woman in the White House. There's some people who liked it, some people who didn't. Ideally, what the message needs to be is we want the best candidate possible for all in the White House. And in this case, it just happens to be a woman, which is a bonus. It's a bingo for everybody. So, but saying that you should vote for me because I'm a woman, I think diminishes the actual importance or the value of what women bring. It just says, vote for me because of the gender. I think that limits women's values. Vocally, I thought that Harris was the most consistently presidential sounding. She had no upspeak. She used great, strategically consistent intonation. She was concise in her points. She did not have run-on sentences. It was well-paced, good speed, and well-timed pauses. She projects the most the most consistent balance of confidence, passion, and authority without ever crossing the line into those dangerous territories of being overly emotional, witchy, or if you will, bitchy, whiny, or screechy. It was just a very consistent, calm strength. And I think that's what America is really looking for right now. And then visually, a distinction between her and Warren was that she also pointed fingers sometimes, but it was up. The back of the palm was toward the audience, and it was like saying, I want you to hear this one critical thing. This is critical. Listen to this one. It was one, not you. And that small shift makes this acceptable and this a little defensiveness inspiring. So again, I think she was the best performer of the night. And last but not least, Marianne Williamson. For me, she gets the award for the most entertaining in the evening. She was, frankly, the most full of contradictions in both content and delivery, kind of full Jekyll and Hyde mode, and she would pivot on a dime in the middle of the sentence. There were a couple of points where she started out really well, and frankly, I was surprised and impressed that she was that clear, concise, insightful, rational, and true. And then suddenly she'd shift gears and I'd go, okay, wait, where did that come from? And oh my goodness, where are we going with this? She started well, stating that things like current pharma prices are so high because the U.S.'s government set a deal without any provision to negotiate prices, and how this is part of the regular corruption. That's how multinational corporations have their way with us. I thought, okay, that's a good quote. But then she suddenly shifted gears. And she says, so, it's really nice that we have all these plans, but if you think we're going to beat Donald Trump with all these plans, then you've got another thing coming. And she's suddenly attacking all of the other people. She goes, he didn't win with a plan. He just said, make America great again. We have to go deep, not superficial. And I'm going, who is this person and where did she come from? And I don't understand what you're praising versus what you're criticizing. Is make America great again better than the plan? Which one is superficial and which one is deep? And I don't know where she was going. It was just sort of this stream of consciousness, random tirade. And, where she'd started to get some really solid footing, she lost it completely. The second contradiction was with regard to refugee children. She made a great, really tight, pithy point in the beginning about how the fact that we've been forcibly removing children from their parents in any other context would be considered kidnapping, and putting them into detention centers that inflict chronic trauma would be viewed as child abuse and should be viewed as such, regardless of the fact that this is the government that is mandating these actions. That I thought was powerful in its analysis. But then again, she shifted on a dime, started talking about healthcare, and looked at the rest of the panelists with a broad accusation and said, well, where have you been, guys? And then went on to a whole other tirade about that. And I'm going, she just shifts gears from this extremely poised, very authoritative, very clean and impressive sounding person to like, oh my gosh. And I just think, okay, the melodrama needs to go. And she did it a third time, switching again from a moment of that poignant clarity into abstract fluff. Again, she didn't have any sound bites specifically, but she did, interestingly enough, reinforce my point about how sound bites ideally should have a what by when concrete outcome. This is something I said in my previous video. She didn't say that specifically, but she demonstrated it by mentioning that John F. Kennedy had said that as an illustration of what she believed their campaign promises needed to illustrate was something concrete, inspirational, and aspirational, in that Kennedy had said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Great example. But then again, she just switched gears and she starts talking in these grand literary terms and grand literary dramatic voice about how John Kennedy was from the era that included great dreams and great plans, and how her career has not been built on making political plans, but on harnessing the inspiration and the excitement of people. And I just thought, again, okay, what? So you're telling me you'd be a better president and policymaker because you're the only one who has no experience making policy? You're just going to inspire people with dreams and what? So again, she's a poem maker, not a policy maker. Her only consistency was her inconsistency, and that's not going to win votes. So I predict that she'll be the first one summarily exiting stage left from this particular group. So there you have it. There's this basic analysis of the messaging strategies, content, and delivery of the original 6 women candidates from the Democratic Party who were throwing their hat into the ring in hopes of becoming the Democratic nominee for the 2020 political election. I'm Dr. Laura Sicola with Focal Impact Productions. For more information, check out my website at focalimpactproductions.com and check out my new book, Speaking to Influence, Mastering Your Leadership Voice. It's available on Amazon in paperback, in ebook, as well as in audiobook format. If this struck a chord with you today, please write back to me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. And be sure to share with your friends, families, and sphere of influence on social media. This is something we all need to be aware of. I look forward to hearing from you, and stay tuned for the next round of videos analyzing the candidates' performance in upcoming presidential debates.